At the age of 76, Billy Joel began doing things that left even those closest to him speechless. He gave away the handwritten music manuscripts he had kept his entire life, handed his very first harmonica to a strange little boy backstage, and recorded short videos that sounded like farewell messages. There was one time he stood in front of the piano, gently touched the keys as if it were a final caress, and quietly said, "I think I've gone far enough." No one heard those words without feeling a chill down their spine. But to understand the weight of that moment, you have to look back at how, throughout his life, he had touched the hearts of the world. From the dark bars where he played piano just to get by, to Madison Square Garden, where he set a historic record with a concert residency that lasted an entire decade. From Piano Man, the song that became the anthem for lost souls, to The Stranger, Glass Houses, An Innocent Man, and albums that sold tens of millions of copies, Billy Joel was not just a musician. He was the living memory of American culture. He won 6 Grammy Awards, sold more than 150 million albums, became one of the most celebrated solo artists in history, and was the only performer to make MSG his second home. But behind those dazzling lights was a man carrying far too much hidden pain. From the age of 8, when his father left without a single explanation, to the suicide attempts in his youth because he felt worthless. From the financial betrayals that nearly wiped out everything he owned, to the failed marriages that left him drinking alone in silence. NPH disease has caused his memory to fade, his hands to tremble over the keys that once felt like an extension of his soul. Yet even as his body betrayed him, his will never surrendered. Billy still walked onto the stage, still sang even when he had to struggle to remember the lyrics, still smiled even though his heart was terrified of what was coming. Because all his life, he believed that music was not just a career. It was the only way he could fight the darkness. And he never backed down. Billy Joel's childhood was not woven from laughter or family dinners gathered around the table, the way people often describe great artists who grew up surrounded by love. It was pieced together from empty spaces, sudden slamming doors, and a loss that he only fully understood as an adult, the day his father walked out of their Levittown home without ever looking back. Billy was just a 6-year-old child then, standing in the living room with socks still wet from the rain, watching his father's figure disappear as though it were nothing more than a passing breeze. But the echo of that moment never faded. It quietly exploded inside the little boy, then sank down, lay dormant beneath layers of time, only to grow a little bigger each year, becoming the shadow that Billy carried with him all the way to the days he stood on the stage at Madison Square Garden. His mother, a woman both strong and fragile, tried to hide her own despair behind forced smiles and hands that shook from overwork. She taught lessons, took small nameless acting roles, did whatever it took to keep the house warm that his father had abandoned. Billy watched it all from the corner of the kitchen, his mother's exhausted eyes, her shoulders growing thinner month by month, the sighs she swallowed so they wouldn't hurt her son anymore. He saw her bite her lip until it bled, while searching a purse that held only a few coins, heard her lie, "Everything will be okay," even when she clearly didn't believe her own words. For Billy, his mother's love was the only light in a childhood stained with dirt, but it was also the thing that haunted him his whole life, because he knew she had sacrificed everything to fight against a void that was far too large. At school, Billy found no refuge. He was too small, too sensitive, too different to fit in with the crowd. The other kids mocked him, called him Nancy Boy because of his soft appearance, Jew Kid because of his Jewish heritage, Mama's Boy because he always clung to his mother to escape the feeling of being out of place in a world that was too loud. They snatched books from his hands, shoved him against walls, threw crumpled paper at his back, and laughed uproariously whenever he stammered in class. Those wounds didn't come from fists, but from words sharp as knives. Every evening on the way home, Billy would take a long time before daring to walk through the door, as if he were afraid his mother would see the sadness knotted on his face. He chose silence to protect her, and that very silence pushed the pain even deeper inside, turning it into a bruise that smoldered for the rest of his life and never fully healed. The only place Billy didn't feel judged was the old piano in the living room. It was the one thing his father had left behind, not out of intent, but because it was too bulky to take when he walked out. And ironically, that forgotten object became the lifeline that saved Billy from despair. When he placed his hands on the keys, the little boy stepped into another world, a world where no one called him cruel names, where no one abandoned him, where broken melodies could say the things he didn't dare speak aloud. There were nights when Billy played until he fell asleep on the bench, his cheeks still streaked with tears that hadn't dried. The piano didn't answer back, but it was always there. And sometimes, just having one thing that wouldn't leave you was enough to keep going. But those nights also planted questions in Billy's soul that were far too big for a child, especially the question he carried with him his entire life. If I disappeared, would anyone notice? That question never went away. It followed Billy in every song, every failed relationship, every night he drank to forget his own childhood. It is there in The Stranger, in Vienna, in And So It Goes, like a wound that never fully scars over. Many years later, when Billy stood on stage in front of tens of thousands of people, the lights shining straight into his face, illuminating a living legend, no one knew that beneath that strong image was still the little boy from Levittown, standing in the dark, listening to the footsteps of a father walking away forever. That childhood didn't just make Billy an artist. It created a soul that was always searching for love, always afraid of loss, always hurting more than normal. And it was that very fragility that turned him into the greatest storyteller of wounded hearts. Billy Joel wasn't born to become a legend. He was born from ruins and learned to stand up again through music. And that is why every note he played carried the echo of a shattered childhood that the world has never fully heard. In the final years of his teens and into his 20s, Billy Joel carried the still unhealed wounds of childhood into the world of music, where he thought his dream would save him from the old pain. But he didn't know that this very path would tear his heart open once more painfully, more deeply, more cruelly than any blow he had ever taken from the kids at school. His first band, the Hassles, was the small dream he tried to piece together with the hope of a poor young man who believed that if he just worked hard and stayed sincere, everything would turn out fine. But the Hassles failed in silence. They released an album, went on tour, signed a contract, but what they got in return were only harsh, biting reviews. The press mocked them as bland, out of place, forgettable. Billy sat in the corner of the recording studio hugging his guitar, trying to hide his sadness behind a faint smile. He wasn't upset about the failure itself, but because for the first time in his life, he realized that trying hard didn't guarantee being loved. Then came Attila, a strange band made up of Billy and his closest friend, John Small. They chose an organ rock, heavy metal style, a bold choice that the press treated as a joke. The first review wrote, "Attila sounds like a chainsaw in a slaughterhouse." That line became something Billy never forgot, not because of its cruelty, but because it taught him that even something he poured his whole heart into could be crushed without mercy. But the mockery from the outside world didn't hurt as much as the knife in the back. Billy discovered that the wife he loved deeply, Elizabeth, had been cheating with the very best friend in the band, the man he treated like a brother, the one he trusted enough to hand over his newly forming career. Betrayal for Billy wasn't just losing a marriage, it was losing faith in people, losing the one thing he had managed to hold on to from his broken childhood, the belief that someone, somewhere, wouldn't abandon him. The day he learned the truth, Billy was silent for a very long time. No shouting, no blaming, no smashing things, Just a silence heavy as lead, the silence of someone who had been abandoned once before, and was now being abandoned a second time by the very people he had opened his heart to. Friends later recalled that Billy walked out of the house with a face so empty it was frightening. He wandered the streets like a shadow, like a man who no longer knew where to place his heart now that its last shelter had collapsed. In the weeks that followed, Billy sank into profound despair. He couldn't sleep, stopped eating, no longer felt that music was a place to breathe. The piano, the thing that had once saved him, could no longer soothe the fresh, gaping wound. He struck the keys so hard his fingers bled, but the sound was cold like stones rolling into an abyss. He once wrote, "I thought I could handle anything, but I was wrong." Then came the fateful night in 1970, a night longer than any other, darker than any sadness Billy had ever known. He wrote a short note on a scrap of paper, sorry for not being good enough. Then he swallowed an entire bottle of sleeping pills. No crying. No one to stop him. No one who knew. It wasn't an impulsive act. It was the result of a lifetime believing that his own disappearance could be as light as a breath, that the world would keep turning without him, that he wasn't worth remembering. But fate or irony caused him to wake up in the hospital. When he opened his eyes, Billy saw the white lights shining down on his face, his chest heavy as if weighed down by stones. And the first thing he felt wasn't relief at being alive, but shame for not having died. He told his closest friend, "I can't do anything right, not even leaving this life." From that moment on, Billy carried within him the feeling of having lost to himself, a feeling that no later victory, no Grammy, no millions of albums sold, no tens of thousands of people singing along to Piano Man could ever completely erase. But that desperate survival opened a different path, one where Billy had to learn again how to rise from below zero, from the deepest bottom of darkness. And only after touching that deepest bottom did he realize that music still had something it wanted to say through him, even when he believed he had nothing left to give the world. After facing death and surviving in bitterness, Billy walked out of the hospital, no longer the young man carrying even a fragile sliver of hope for the future. He was more like an empty shell, a person who had tried to leave this world and failed, a person who didn't know what he had left to fight for. But he still had one music contract to fulfill, and even though his soul was torn to shreds, Billy decided to pour whatever remained inside him into his debut album, like a desperate message sent into the void. If the world won't listen to me, at least I will have spoken. That album was called Cold Spring Harbor, and the name, later on, became a symbol for a period when life nearly crushed him completely. Billy wanted this album to be a mirror, reflecting his most hidden pain. The melodies written from sleepless nights, from afternoons he spent alone in a small room, listening to rain falling through the window, from tears that dropped onto the piano keys and left dried salt streaks on the wooden surface. Every song was a confession, a piece of his soul torn out and placed on the operating table, hoping someone would see the real him, not the damaged or mocked version the world was used to seeing. But when the album was released, what happened to it felt like a punch to the chest, hard, cold, and cruel. The record label had sped up the master too much, causing Billy's voice to be pitched higher and distorted, sounding more like a joke than the singing of someone who had poured his heart into it. Critics called the album weird, unprofessional, a voice that sounds squeezed. No one knew the mistake wasn't Billy's. No one knew that the label, the last place he had put his trust, had accidentally or intentionally ruined all his hard work. For Billy, it wasn't just a professional failure. It was the cruel message that even when he tried to stand on solid ground again after falling into the abyss, the world itself was the one pushing him back into the darkness. He once said, "I felt like the universe was deliberately trying to put me out," and he believed it not because he was pessimistic, but because everything that happened was too bad to be random. But the chain of tragedies didn't stop there. The contract he had signed before forming Attila when he was young, naive, and desperate to escape a life of poverty turned out to be a trap. The deal was so unfair that Billy received almost nothing from the album, and if he wanted to keep releasing music, he had to follow every exploitative clause the label demanded. He was stuck an artist with a soul already breaking, still forced to keep running on a path others had lined with thorns. In the months after the album's release, Billy's life sank to a frightening low. He was so poor, he had to eat raw noodles, drink tap water, and choose between paying the electric bill or the rent. On winter nights, the apartment was so cold that Billy sat hunched over the piano, as if the warmth from the wood could keep him alive a few more hours. He wrote music, not because anyone was waiting for it, but because music was the only thing keeping him from completely disappearing. Some nights he wrote until his hands went numb, tears falling onto the page and smudging the ink, creating black streaks like blood flowing from his own heart. Billy said that back then, he believed no one would ever really hear me. He wrote just to prove he still existed, that even if the world wasn't on his side, he still had one small sound to fight against, the silence swallowing him whole. And it was in that deepest darkness, where his career was destroyed, where his soul was crushed, where his voice was turned into a joke. Through no fault of his own, it was right there that Billy Joel began to form the thing that would take him to the top in the years to come. The will to survive, not the will to succeed, not the will to become famous, but the will not to be erased from this world one more time. Because after Cold Spring Harbor, Billy had nothing left to lose, and that was what made him dangerous in the most beautiful way art can create. After Cold Spring Harbor was ruined and left Billy with a despair that no apology from the label could ever heal, he left Los Angeles and hid in California under the fake name Bill Martin. He didn't want anyone to recognize him anymore. He didn't want anyone to mention that failed album. He didn't want anyone to see the face of a man who had nearly died, who had been betrayed, who had been turned into a laughingstock in the world he once hoped would be his home. Billy did the only thing he knew how to do: play piano to get through the day. He found work in a dark bar, where the smell of cigarette smoke clung to every strand of hair. Hoarse laughter echoed every night, and lost souls gathered as if the neon light outside was the only thing still tying them to life. And strangely, in that space where no one came looking for art, only to escape themselves, Billy found his truth. Every night he played music for men sitting alone with their wedding rings removed, for women drinking to forget someone's name, for the unemployed, for dreamers tired of dreaming. He looked at them and saw himself the nameless wounds, the unspoken pain, the lives society didn't care whether they continued or not. His compositions gradually turned into the small stories he heard around him. The bartender talking about unfinished dreams, the waitress who wanted to be an actress but never had money for auditions, the regular customer who was once a baseball star and now only had a few memories to hold on to. All of them became tiny pieces in the sad picture Billy carried in his heart. And in a cold, dark corner of the bar, where Billy sat alone after performing, with tired hands resting on his knees, a song began to breathe inside him. That song wasn't written to sell. It wasn't written to become famous. It wasn't written to regain honor. It was only a confession. I'm sinking, and I don't know how to come up for air. That was Piano Man. As Billy wrote each line, each image of the people around him, he didn't embellish, didn't romanticize, didn't make them more tragic or more beautiful than they were. He wrote exactly what he saw. A bartender named John, a waiter named Davy, an old man waiting for mail, lonely customers who didn't celebrate Friday like a holiday, but only drank to forget another meaningless week had passed. But the deepest part wasn't in them. It was in Billy. Every character in the song was a part of his own soul, a part of the childhood abandonment, a part of the betrayed heart, a part of the young man who once swallowed sleeping pills in an empty room. When Piano Man was born, it wasn't just a song. It was the cry of weary souls finding each other in the dark, a prayer for the people the world had forgotten. No one, not even Billy, thought it would succeed. He once said, "It's such a sad song. I don't understand why people would want to listen to it." But people listened, and people cried. They realized Billy wasn't writing about them. Billy was writing for them. And suddenly, the world knew him as the storyteller of the losers, the people no one wanted to talk about, but everyone quietly carried inside themselves. When the song became a national hit, Billy just bowed his head and sighed, saying the words those around him never forgot. "I just sing about sadness. What's happy about that?" Success didn't make him happy. It only confirmed what he had always known. Pain, when spoken aloud, has a strange power, and sometimes that's the only way to survive. Piano Man didn't save him, but it pulled him out of the darkness long enough for the world to see him, to reach out to him, to say he mattered. And for the first time in his life, Billy felt that even if only in that fragile moment, he was no longer completely alone. The success of Piano Man took Billy out of that dark bar from years before, but it didn't take him out of himself. When the stage lights began to shine on his life, Billy understood a truth that artists with hearts too soft easily recognize. Success is not a cure. It is only a light that clearly illuminates the pain he had hidden for so long. After his first real tour, Billy returned to his small apartment with the old piano, sat down, and looked at his hands trembling slightly. He was tired. Not tired from the work, but tired from his own soul, a soul that had never rested, never been forgiven, never been fully loved. And then, instead of trying to heal, Billy did what he always did when he didn't know how to live. He wrote music. The songs of the stranger were not written from joy, from victory, or from the confidence of a rising artist. They were written like the desperate diary entries of a man trying to run from the shadow too large inside him. Each track was like a cut reopening. Vienna was born from the feeling that Billy belonged nowhere, from the childhood pain of abandonment, from the tearing between running as fast as possible to prove his worth, and the longing to stop, just to breathe once. He wrote that song on a windy afternoon, looking out the window and asking himself, "Why do I have to be like this? Why do I have to keep running?" Vienna was the words he said to the lost child inside him, the child who had never been held. You can slow down. You don't have to be perfect. But ironically, the world saw that song as a masterpiece, while for Billy, it was only the sigh of an exhausted heart. Only the good die young. It sounds rebellious and upbeat, but it is really the words of a man so familiar with loss that he jokes with death like an old friend. He wrote the song after a night drinking alone, sitting in a dark room, wondering if good people always leave before they get to be loved enough. And in that darkness, he wrote each line with bitterness, mixed with a sarcastic smile, the smile of someone who no longer fears pain because he has already hurt too much. Then came Just the Way You Are, the song the whole world thought was the most beautiful love letter. But Billy wrote it when his heart didn't have a single moment of peace. He wrote it to hold together a marriage that was slowly cracking, to convince himself that love could be enough to save someone, enough to save him. But when he sang, "I love you just the way you are," Billy knew deep down he wasn't saying it to his wife. He was saying it to himself, to the part he still hated, the part that made him feel not enough, the part that nearly made him leave life in 1970. The Stranger became the album Billy wrote not to live, but to not disappear. He sat in the studio for hours on end, gritting his teeth against pressure that felt like a rope tightening around his neck a little more each day. Columbia Records had warned him. If this album failed, they would drop him. That didn't just mean the end of his career. It meant Billy would have no place left to pour out the wounds he had carried for 30 years of his life. He walked into the studio with the fear of being abandoned again, and so he fought as if this were his last chance to exist. He edited every vocal line with the harshness of a desperate perfectionist. He recorded each section over and over until his hands went numb. He lost sleep for nights, just thinking about the possibility of failure. People around him said Billy barely spoke to anyone during the entire recording, as if he were walking into a pitch-black tunnel and could only go alone. But then, the unexpected happened. The Stranger didn't just succeed, it became a masterpiece. It propelled Billy into legendary status. It sold more than 10 million copies. It earned 4 Grammy nominations. It completely changed Billy's position in the music world. And when the album was released, people praised the depth, the subtlety, the honesty in every word Billy wrote. They called him a genius. But on the first night he heard the album had reached the top of the charts, Billy didn't celebrate. He sat alone in his room, the dim yellow light falling on his tired face, his eyes red from lack of sleep, and he whispered the words he had kept inside for years. Bad days inspired the best music, but they destroyed me as a person. That wasn't a complaint. It was the truth of someone who used his own wounds to feed his art, to create beauty from brokenness. Billy understood that, without those terrible days, he would never have become the Billy Joel the world knew. But the price was his own soul, worn away little by little. The Stranger was a miracle for his career, but a brutal battle with the real man inside him. And both of those things were truths that could not be separated. Billy entered the next years of his life as a lonely genius, someone who could touch the hearts of millions, but could not heal his own heart. The Stranger succeeded as if it were destiny, but it was also a bitter reminder that sometimes the world only hears your voice when you are hurting so much you can barely breathe. The success of The Stranger propelled Billy Joel to a height that even he could never have imagined. But what no one knew was that that height had no light. It was a cold, empty place where the roaring applause only made the silence afterward feel heavier. After that album, Billy threw himself into touring like a machine, programmed to keep running forever. Every night, a different city. Every morning waking up in a hotel room identical to the one from the day before, to the point where he would often stand in the middle of the room for a few minutes trying to remember where he was. He once said, "I went through hundreds of hotels, but I can't remember a single one. They were all cold boxes, and I was the shadow wandering inside them." The loneliness of a man loved by the whole world became the greatest isolation of his life. His relationship with his ex-wife cracked not because of a lack of love, but because of a lack of quiet moments for two people to find each other. Billy was always on the road, on stage, on planes, but rarely at home. The arguments, the invisible distances, the words left unspoken, all contributed to breaking his soul into even more pieces, a soul that the Stranger had exposed but never healed. Stress weighed on him like a soaked cloak, dragging him to the bottom of every day. He suffered from constant insomnia, tossing and turning until morning, watching the clock tick away the hours as if it were poking at his helplessness. When he did sleep, it was fragile, interrupted by constant jolts, never peaceful. Anxiety clung to him like a shadow, impossible to escape. On stage, Billy became someone else powerful, radiant, unbreakable. His piano sounded like magic, his voice full of confidence, making tens of thousands of people burst into tears, laugh, hug each other, sing along. On stage, he was an icon, a soul, a hero. But the moment he stepped backstage, his shadow immediately collapsed. Alone in the silent room, Billy looked in the mirror and asked himself, "Who is that guy out there? And why don't I feel anything like him?" The feeling that he was living two lives, one as a legend and one as a man who was falling, began to suffocate him. Billy said in a rare interview from that time, "The whole world loves me, but I don't love myself." That wasn't the statement of someone feeling sorry for himself. It was the confession of a man who had gone too far from his own self. The emptiness inside him grew larger, so large that music, the thing that had once saved him, was no longer strong enough to fill it. And that was when alcohol appeared. At first, just a few drinks before performing, to relax, to forget the pressure, to make the anxiety fade into the distance. But then, a few drinks turned into a few bottles. Alcohol became the only thing that helped him sleep, the only thing that made him feel like he wasn't falling, the only thing that let him forget that after every thunderous applause out there, he still returned to the cold room where he didn't know who to talk to, didn't know what to face. Billy once admitted, "I drank because I was afraid of being sober. Being sober meant I had to face myself, and I didn't want to." Alcohol didn't make him happy, but it made the sadness more bearable. It blurred the cracks. And as every artist who has walked through darkness understands, when pain is blurred, people mistake it for having disappeared. But it never disappears. It just waits. When the stage lights came on, Billy was the guide for millions of people. When the lights went out, he was a wanderer who no longer recognized the way home. He stood on stage like a god, but walked off like a man falling apart. The tour nights blurred together, and Billy gradually lost all sense of time. He couldn't remember what day of the week it was, what month it was. Everything merged into a gray streak with no beginning and no end. He lived in a state half awake, half drunk, half conscious, half dreaming, half himself and half the person everyone wanted him to be. For others, the pinnacle of a career was paradise. For Billy, it was a locked room inside his own heart, where the cheers couldn't reach, where the audience's love couldn't fill the voids left by childhood, failure, betrayal, and loss. And so, the legend Billy Joel continued to shine in the music sky, while the man Billy Joel slowly sank deeper beneath the surface, finding it harder to breathe each day. On stage, he was immortal. Off stage, he was self-destructing. The 1980s seemed like they would bring Billy the stability he had always been searching for, but instead, they pulled him into another storm. A storm not from within, but from global political pressure. And the night in the Soviet Union in 1987 became the breaking point that even Billy didn't expect he was about to reach. When Billy agreed to become one of the first Western artists to perform in the Soviet Union, he thought it would be a chance to connect, a moment when music could cross borders, but he didn't know he was stepping onto a stage where the atmosphere was more oppressive than any he had ever stood on. Political pressure weighed on every breath. The American government saw the trip as a symbol of soft diplomacy. The Soviets saw it as an experiment in controlling the public. The organizers feared that every action of his was being watched under a microscope. Billy just wanted to sing, but everyone else wanted him to play the role of a political strategist, something he never was. When the show began, he immediately sensed something was wrong. Long lines of police stood close to the stage like a black wall. Powerful lights shone directly into the audience's faces, not to support the performance, but to monitor, to keep them from getting too excited, to stop them from standing up, dancing, or expressing too much emotion. A music stage, but with the atmosphere of a trial. Billy looked down. The audience tried to clap, but were stared down by police. Children wanted to stand, but were pulled back into their seats. Smiles were replaced by tension. He played the piano, but every note sounded strangled halfway out. Then, the moment came. While Billy was singing, the lights shining into the audience suddenly flared again. Brighter, harsher, as if they wanted to extinguish the tiny freedom music had brought. Billy saw young faces trying to shield their eyes, trying to stand and dance, but being forced to sit. He saw himself at 10 years old, bullied, forced to shrink, stripped of the chance to be himself. Something inside Billy shattered. He shouted, "Stop lighting the audience!" But the lights didn't go off. He shouted louder, a roar full of the desperation of someone who had endured too much in life. The lights still didn't go off. And Billy, the man who had once swallowed a bottle of sleeping pills, who had stood alone in a dark bar singing for lost souls, who had braced himself against emptiness on stage for years, lost control. He stood up abruptly and slammed down on the piano as if it weren't an instrument but the entire pain he had swallowed for 3 decades. He slammed until the instrument shook like a breaking heart. He slammed until his hands turned red. He slammed until the entire stage fell silent. In front of the stunned thousands in the audience, they didn't see a legend in rage. They saw a human being collapsing. A human who could no longer bear being forced to be strong, to be perfect, to shine. A human who didn't want to be a political symbol. A human who just wanted music to be music. The show continued, but Billy's heart felt like stone. He finished the performance with a hoarse voice, walked backstage, closed the door, and broke down. No one had seen him cry like that before. He sat in a chair, hands over his face, his whole body trembling slightly, as if he had finally given up carrying pain he could no longer bear. Those close to him heard the words he said in the suffocating silence, "I can't take it anymore." That night wasn't just an outburst. It was the explosion of 30 years of hurt, 30 years of silence, 30 years of having to be strong, while deep down he only wanted to be weak. The 1987 Soviet night didn't destroy Billy Joel. It only showed the world that before he was a legend, he was a human being, and that human being had nearly broken completely. After the 1987 Soviet night, Billy thought he had hit rock bottom emotionally, that nothing in life could break him further. But he didn't know that the greatest crisis of his life was still waiting ahead. Not from inner emptiness, not from stage pressure, but from the place he thought was safest, family. And that pain, later on, became the deepest, most brutal wound, making even the piano slamming in the Soviet night seem small. The man who cheated him wasn't a stranger. It was his brother-in-law, Frank Weber, the manager who had handled him for many years, the man Billy saw as family, as the protector from the chaos of the music industry. Billy trusted Frank the way a child abandoned by his father trusts any man willing to stay. Absolutely, unconditionally, to the point where he never thought he could be betrayed again. But Frank exploited that trust and exploited the vulnerability in Billy's heart to embezzle, defraud, make bad investments, open hidden accounts, and use Billy's own money to fund his luxurious lifestyle. When the scandal broke, the figure shocked the entire music world. $90 million. Nearly everything Billy had accumulated over 2 decades on stage. A lifetime of work? A lifetime under the lights? A lifetime enduring loneliness to write songs that made the world cry? Gone. In the blink of an eye, Billy later recounted that the moment he learned the truth, he didn't scream, didn't smash anything, didn't rage like in 1987. He just stood still, silent for so long that people thought he had stopped breathing. Because in that moment, Billy understood he hadn't just lost money. He had lost trust. He had lost the rare sense of safety he had tried to build around a life that was already so fragile. For Billy, being betrayed by someone he trusted was worse than betrayal in love, because love can be wrong, can be blind. But family, or someone called family, is the only place a soul once abandoned finds shelter. And now, that shelter had collapsed too. Everything turned to ashes. The only question Billy uttered that night he learned the truth was just 3 words. Why him, too? Just like when his father left. Just like when his best friend betrayed him. Just like when he wondered why life kept taking away the people he trusted. The outside world only saw the $90 million, but inside Billy, that pain couldn't be measured in money. It was the despair of someone who had spent his whole life searching for unconditional love and kept being abandoned. And what made everything even worse was that Billy was forced to do the thing he hated most. Sue the very person he had once considered flesh and blood. The lawsuit dragged on, ugly, exposing details of how Frank had exploited him for years. But winning in court brought no release. Billy didn't feel he had regained anything. Instead, He felt guilty for dragging family into a battlefield. He felt ashamed for being weak enough to be taken advantage of. He felt as if he himself had betrayed the meaning of family, even though the truth was completely the opposite. Billy once wrote in his journal, "I wasn't sure life was worth continuing." Depression returned, more ferocious, drowning him deeper than the days in 1970 when he swallowed sleeping pills. But this time, the pain didn't come from personal despair. It came from feeling stupid, blind, exploited, and once again not good enough to be truly loved by anyone. He drank more, slept less, woke up in the middle of the night with his heart clenched, as if being squeezed. On stage, he was still Billy Joel, the legend, the genius, the hero of millions, but off stage, he was a man stripped of everything, standing in a big house he wasn't sure still belonged to him. Friends said that many nights Billy sat in the dark studio, lights off, just staring at the piano keys without touching them. He was afraid that if he played a single note, what would come out wouldn't be music, but a cry for help. He had survived suicide, survived career failures, survived dozens of other pains, but this betrayal nearly knocked down completely the man who was already cracked inside. When he lost $90 million, Billy Joel didn't just lose money. He lost a part of his soul, the part that still believed the world, no matter how cruel, had some corner left for kindness. And in the months after the lawsuit, Billy lived like a man lost in his own life, carrying the name of a legend, but in his heart, only the empty echo of the question he had carried since he was 6 years old. Will anyone ever really stay with me? After the $90 million betrayal that nearly caused Billy to collapse completely, he entered a phase where every light in his life seemed to go out all at once. And in that darkness, the marriages that were supposed to finally bring him peace also shattered under the weight of old wounds that had never healed. Christy Brinkley appeared in his life like a miracle, a radiant supermodel, gentle, full of light, the one who brought Billy what he believed was unconditional love. They looked like a couple stepped out of a fairy tale. She was one of the most beautiful women in the world, and he was the artist who wrote songs that made all of humanity tremble. But for Billy, that happiness was more fragile than anyone could imagine. The crowds always whispered, "He's not worthy of her." They said it in his ear. They said it behind his back. They said it in articles. They said it in interviews. They said it until it turned into a knife, twisting right into the deepest wound of his life. The feeling from childhood that he wasn't enough, wasn't deserving of love, wasn't worth anyone staying. Christy loved him, but Billy's insecurity was too great. And when the pressures from his career, the panic attacks, and the shadows of alcohol flooded in, their marriage wavered. The small, hurtful words built up into distance, then distance into silence, and silence into breakdown. When they divorced, Billy said something that made his friends choke with pain. "I tried, but I don't know how to hold on to happiness." He believed he was the problem. He believed he wasn't worthy, even of the most beautiful love of his life. But Billy's life didn't stop at one breakdown. Many years later, he married Katie Lee, someone much younger than him. And right from the start, the media pounced on that story like a pack of predators. She's too young. He's too old. The age difference is ridiculous. She'll leave him anyway. Every headline was a cut. Every comment was a drop of acid into Billy's heart. He tried to act strong, tried to smile for the cameras, but inside, he once again heard the child in him whispering, "I'm not good enough." And so the pressure weighed down on the relationship until it couldn't breathe anymore. And when that marriage fell apart, Billy realized the thing that hurt him most wasn't losing his wife. It was that he no longer believed he deserved any kind of love at all. Alcohol, the dark companion, returned and took over his life. At first, just a few drinks to silence the media noise, to silence the words he repeated in his head, to silence the shame, to silence the fear. But then, a few drinks turned into a few bottles. All night. No sleep, Drinking to forget, then drinking so he didn't need to forget anymore. Drinking to numb a soul that had been dissected too many times. Alcohol made him hazy, but it also made him feel like he could breathe easier. And like every tragedy that lasts long enough, it didn't stop at emotions, it became a real danger. One night, in a drunken blur, Billy rode his motorcycle on the winding roads of Long Island and lost control. The bike skidded across the pavement, spun 3 times, and he nearly got thrown into a concrete ditch. People said he escaped death by a hair. But Billy thought differently. He said afterward, "I don't know if I was trying to live or trying to die." In the hospital room, when he looked at his bruised face reflected in the glass, Billy saw something that chilled him more than the crash. He no longer recognized the man in the mirror. Messy hair, eyes red from alcohol, a face worn out from sleeplessness, a body heavy with despair, all combined to paint the picture of someone self-destructing without being able to stop. Billy later talked about that moment. "I looked in the mirror and saw a man dying slowly, little by little. And the scariest part was that he wasn't sure he wanted to save that man or not." The broken marriages, the wounds from betrayal, the world's slander, and the alcohol brought Billy almost to the final limit of his endurance. But the darkness hadn't swallowed him yet, because deep down, even though he was exhausted to the point of wanting to give up, Billy's heart still tried to beat a little more, as if it were waiting for something, or someone, to pull him back from the edge. He just didn't know it was coming, and it would change his entire life. After years worn down by alcohol, accidents, breakdowns, and self-doubt, Billy Joel entered the early 1990s like a man almost completely exhausted. He still performed, still smiled for the audience, still tried to maintain the image of a legend, but inside, a part of his soul had gone cold. And then, from that emptiness, River of Dreams was born not as a pop album, but as a farewell. Right from the first melodies, people could feel that Billy was no longer writing music to live, but to breathe. The album was like a thick black river flowing through his soul, carrying years of suffering, years of torment that had never been fully expressed. He wrote lyrics like someone desperately searching for a way out of the very thoughts drowning him. Even though the melodies seemed strong and steady, every word was the choked groan of a heart that had stood too long under the weight of life. In River of Dreams, he sang about journeys through dark fields, roads with no way out, broken dreams as if he were tracing his own footsteps in the night, trying to understand why life had brought him here. Not a single song carried any glamour. All were soaked in the weariness of a man who had lived too many lives in one. In the middle of the night, I go walking in my sleep. The opening line sounded like a confession. Billy could no longer tell what was dream, what was reality, what was day, what was night. He wandered in his own mind, lost like the child who once sat at the old piano searching for temporary peace. After the album's release, everyone could clearly see what Billy didn't want to say aloud. This was the album of someone trying to say goodbye without admitting he was saying goodbye. Interviews from that time all noted Billy was exhausted to the point he could no longer hide it. He attended events with a gaunt face, tired eyes, a smile that no longer reached his eyes. And then he said the thing that stunned the world. Billy Joel announced he would stop writing pop music forever. Not temporarily, not a break, forever. His fans, the ones who grew up with Piano Man, loved Vienna, broke down with Just the Way You Are, couldn't believe it. They wrote letters. They begged. They asked, "Why, Billy?" They thought he was angry, disillusioned, or wanted to change styles. But the truth was much more painful. When asked, Billy only answered in a small, weary voice, like someone about to turn to dust. "I have nothing left to say. What remains is just pain." That wasn't the statement of an artist out of inspiration. It was the words of someone spiritually depleted, someone who didn't want to write more painful chapters into his life, someone who had used music like a life raft for 3 decades, and now he no longer had the strength to hold on. For Billy, River of Dreams wasn't an album ending an era. It was the final stone he placed to bury the old part of his life, the part full of scars, full of loss, full of nights sinking into alcohol to forget himself. The album was like a farewell he sang to save his own soul. I've fought long enough. Let me rest. And when the stage lights continued to shine on him in the tours that followed, Billy stood there as a performer, but no longer as a songwriter. He had locked away the part of his heart that once wrote masterpieces, not because it was empty, but because it hurt too much to keep flowing. River of Dreams became the closing chapter of a book Billy never wanted to open again. A beautiful book, but also soaked in tears, the tears of an artist who always sang for the whole world to hear, but could never sing for himself. After closing River of Dreams and voluntarily leaving the world of songwriting to protect the remaining part of his heart, Billy Joel entered years where music fell silent, but life quietly prepared a small miracle for him. After so many broken marriages, after long nights drinking himself to exhaustion, after all the losses that made him believe he was born to be alone, Billy no longer expected love. He was too tired to hope, too hardened to believe happiness could come a second time. And then Alexis Roderick appeared not like the blinding flash of fairy tales, but like a small flame warm enough for him to want to hold his hands near. She didn't see Billy as a legend, didn't see him as a cultural icon, didn't see him through the fog of expectations or glamour. She saw him as a human being, a man who had loved, who had failed, who had staggered drunk from loneliness, who carried wounds that time couldn't erase. And that gentle gaze made Billy, for the first time in years, feel like he didn't have to brace himself to be anyone. With Alexis, he was just Billy. The man Billy, not Piano Man. That peace came to him not loudly, not intensely, but through small things. Quiet dinners, conversations without defenses, mornings without waking up, feeling he only existed out of obligation. Alexis didn't demand anything from Billy except his presence. And that's something that seemed small, but for someone who had lived his whole life in darkness, became the door leading him back to the light. When they had their first daughter, Billy said the moment he held her in his arms was the only moment in his life he knew for sure he had to live. Not live for fame, not live for the audience, not live to prove he was worthy, but live because someone truly needed him. Their second daughter was born a few years later, and from then on, the two children became the strongest force keeping Billy tethered to this life. They looked at him with clear eyes, knowing nothing of their father's painful past, nothing of the times he stood on the edge, nothing of the nights he drank until he didn't remember who he was. To them, he was just Dad, the man who chased them in the backyard, who fixed toys, who read books every night, who sang lullabies with the warm voice that once shook the world. Their love was unconditional love, the thing Billy had craved since the day his father left. And now, finally, he had it. Even in the early years living with his new family, Billy started writing again, not to release, not to climb the charts, but to whisper to his two little girls the stories he had never dared tell aloud. He wrote unpublished songs, songs just for the two children, like letters to the future. In them were pride, apologies, a soft love that Billy had never allowed himself to show when he was young. He told a friend, "I write so they know I tried. I don't want them to remember me as a sad man." And indeed, the two children changed the trajectory of Billy's life. He drank less, then gradually stopped altogether. He took care of exercising, of health checkups, of holding on to his breath every moment, as if each inhale was a promise to his daughters that he would still be here. The audience sees Billy on stage in recent years, gray hair, slower steps, a rougher voice but warmer eyes. No longer the eyes of someone desperate, but the eyes of someone who had found what he lost long ago, a reason to live. After decades standing amid applause yet still feeling alone, Billy finally had the smallest but most important audience. Two children who ran to hug him every time he left the stage. Not because he was a legend, but because he was home. In that late light, Billy's heart once shattered, once dried up, once turned to ash, began to beat again. Not strongly, not perfectly, but truly. And for him, that was enough. Even though love and his children had pulled Billy back from the edge, that didn't mean the darkness left him. It just stepped back a little, standing behind the stage lights, waiting for him to step out so it could swallow the rest that the world couldn't see. And right at the place considered his immortal temple, Madison Square Garden, Billy experienced the most glorious years, but also the most hollow in his soul. Billy's MSG residency concert series lasted 10 straight years, a feat no solo artist had ever achieved. Every show sold out. Every night, tens of thousands of people from across America, even from around the world, poured in just to hear the melodies that had become collective memories. They saw Billy sitting at the piano, smiling, telling stories, bantering with the audience, as if he were born to stand in that light. They saw him full of life, full of strength, full of youthfulness despite his age. They saw a legend. But they didn't see the man trying to stay upright when the curtain closed. To maintain the packed schedule at ages 65, then 70, then 73, then 76, Billy had to pay a price no audience knew. Physical pain so severe he could barely walk normally. The NPH disease gradually caused him to lose balance, aching from his spine down to his legs, numbness in his hands, making playing the piano feel like fighting his own body. Many nights, before performing, Billy had to lean on two assistants to stand up. Some nights, he lay flat on the backstage floor, eyes closed tight, breathing heavily. The sound of the audience outside roaring, his name echoed like from a distant world. And to have enough strength to step on stage, Billy often had to get painkiller injections directly into his back, his hips, his knees. Those weren't doses to feel better, but doses to be able to stand at all. One doctor once said, "Your body is no longer suited for performing at this intensity." But Billy just nodded. "I know, but I still have promises to keep with the audience." On stage, he hid it all. He walked slowly, but covered it with a smile. His hands trembled on the keys, but he covered it by telling longer stories. He hurt so much his face went pale, but he covered it with the dazzling lights shining down, making people think he was glowing. The audience saw Piano Man, but in Billy's heart, he was just the man fighting against his own body, betraying him day by day. And then came the 100th show, a milestone no artist had ever reached. That performance was promoted like a festival. Fans filled the arena early, carrying signs, wearing T-shirts with his image, toy pianos as tributes. When Billy stepped out, the whole MSG erupted. The cheers were so loud, the stage shook. Everyone thought he was enjoying the greatest moment of his career. But the truth was completely different. Right from the first song, people noticed Billy looking down at his hands as if they belonged to someone else. He pressed the keys a beat slower. He lost focus a few times. He was tired in a way no makeup could hide. Then came the fateful moment when he sang Vienna. The line, "Slow down, you crazy child," rang out in New York's music cathedral like a whispered wound to himself. Vienna was the song Billy wrote for the lost child inside him. But that day, it sounded like a farewell. And when he reached, "You know that when the truth is told," Billy's voice choked. He stopped playing for a few seconds. The entire arena fell dead silent. Then in a moment, no one was prepared for Billy shed tears. Not just one drop, but many. Heavy, slow, as if his whole life, the years of abandonment, betrayal, loss, being crushed by pressure, was flowing down with them. He turned his face away to wipe the tears quickly, trying to hold onto the strong appearance he always did. But the audience had seen it. and they stood up and applauded like they never had in their lives, not to cheer, but to embrace him from afar. That day, people realized, behind the immortal legend was a human being fighting time, and time was slowly winning. Backstage that night, Billy sat down in a chair, breathing like someone who had just run through a storm. He said nothing for a few minutes. Then he whispered, just loud enough for the few people nearby to hear, "I know my time isn't much longer." No one replied. No one dared, because they knew it wasn't complaining. It was the truth Billy had faced for years. The lights were still bright, but inside, his body was slowly crumbling. The MSG residency was glorious, but for Billy, it was also the mask he put on every night to hide the truth that he was in pain, more pain than ever. And behind every applause was a sob no one heard. Billy kept performing, but from that 100th night, he understood something profound. He was singing the final songs of his life, and he knew it clearer than anyone. MSG still shone brightly. The applause still thundered like thunder. Billy still bowed to the audience once a month as he had for a whole decade. But behind those lights, a truth was growing in silence. It wasn't loud. It didn't announce itself. It just crept into Billy's life little by little when he forgot where he put his keys, when he forgot lines he had said thousands of times, when he looked at a familiar face but took a few seconds to remember the name. Early in 2025, after months of the signs becoming more serious, Billy went for a checkup, and then, in the cold room smelling of antiseptic, the doctor walked in with a face Billy could never forget. The doctor said it word by word, slow and heavy. Normal pressure hydrocephalus, NPH, a rare disease, in old age, quietly destroying mobility and memory, a slow death sentence. A cruel way for the body to take him away from the piano, the one thing that had never abandoned him. Billy sat still. No reaction, no questions, no crying. He just looked down at his hands, the hands that had played Vienna, Piano Man, the stranger, but now trembled slightly, like a leaf caught in the wind through the door. And in that moment, his heart sank to the bottom. After the appointment, Billy quietly left the hospital and walked alone to the beach near his home, the place he used to take his two daughters for walks when they were little. He sat down on the sand, cold wind slapping his face, but he felt nothing. Only one sentence repeated in his head, "I will lose myself bit by bit." In the following months, Billy's short-term memory began to decline noticeably. He took longer to remember song lyrics, something that had never happened in 50 years of his career. Some rehearsals, he played wrong chords, then looked at his hands as if they no longer belonged to him. Friends who witnessed those moments later said Billy went quiet, then just whispered, "No, please don't take the piano from me." But the disease knew no mercy. His hands trembled more. Some days, he placed his hands on the keys, but couldn't press hard enough to produce the familiar tone. Every time that happened, Billy sat still for a long time, breathing deeply, as if trying to swallow his tears inside. One of the doctors said bluntly, "There will come a day when you can't play anymore." That sentence hit Billy harder than the motorcycle crash, harder than the 1987 Soviet night, harder than losing $90 million or the shattered marriages. Because for Billy, losing the piano meant losing himself. And he knew his time was being taken away little by little. Facing that truth, Billy began doing what many people don't dare, tidying up his life while he was still lucid enough to do it. He opened the old wooden boxes where he kept mementos from the Hassels era, from Attila, from the poor years in Los Angeles. He held his very first harmonica, the item that had followed him from his bullied childhood, then gave it to a student in a music education program. He said, "It pulled me out of the darkness. I hope it does the same for you." He sent handwritten letters to close friends, not suicide notes, but pre-farewells, words of thanks, apologies, admissions that he had loved them, needed them, lived part of his life for them. One evening, Billy called a few close people to his home and talked to them in the living room filled with soft, golden light. He spoke in a very small voice. "If I go suddenly, remember that I tried. I lived as much as I could live." No one replied. A few turned their faces away because they couldn't bear to look at his eyes. The eyes of someone who knew he was preparing to step through a door that only opens once in life. Then came the final thing that scared his family the most. Billy started recording final messages for his fans, not promotional videos, not tour teasers, but slow, honest words, trembling from the disease and from emotion. "If one day I can't stand on stage anymore, just know that you gave me a life more beautiful than anything I ever dared dream." After he finished recording, the technician in the studio sat silent for a long time before turning off the machine, because they all understood. This wasn't a backup video. This was a real farewell. And then, like every tragedy of a celebrity, rumors appeared. A small news site spread that Billy Joel had passed away in his sleep. The news spread fast, like fire in the wind. Fans cried. Social media exploded. Many wrote, "He had prepared for this. I knew something was wrong." Major news outlets started contacting Madison Square Garden. Reporters called non-stop. Friends panicked. Family was speechless. And by the end of that day, Billy posted a photo on social media. He was smiling, sitting in the kitchen corner, hands on the table. That smile made fans breathe a sigh of relief. But anyone paying close attention would see what most of the world missed. His eyes red and swollen, from sleeplessness, from the disease, from all the fears he hid behind that gentle smile. He didn't deny the illness, didn't deny the rumors. He just wrote one sentence, "Still here." But everyone understood. His life was still there, but thin as a breath. Billy kept performing, kept smiling, kept keeping his promises to the audience. But in his heart, a new page was opening, the final page, and with each passing day, he moved closer to the moment he knew he couldn't avoid. The day Billy Joel had to say goodbye to the piano and to the world. Gradually, as the performances became fewer and farther between, and illness weighed down his aging shoulders, Billy began spending more time alone. Not because he was avoiding the world, but because he wanted to look back at it one last time, with eyes that had witnessed so much that one lifetime might not be enough to bear. On quiet nights in Long Island, with the sea wind carrying a chill through the window panes, Billy sat by his old piano, trembling fingers resting on the keys, but not playing. He just sat there, letting memories pass through him like an endless film reel. The childhood abandonment, the cold, empty house, his exhausted mother, the kids mocking him until he believed he wasn't good enough for anyone, the years eating raw noodles to chase his music dream, the nights in dark bars where he sang for drunks, for the forgotten souls of the world, and for his own shadow, the 1970 sleeping pill attempt, when he believed life had nothing left for him, his debut album ruined to the point of becoming a joke, the repeated stabs of betrayal, friends, family, those he loved, the broken loves, the long nights of torment between alcohol and his own gaunt face in the mirror, the years standing at the top of the world but sinking deepest into loneliness, and finally illness coming to take away the thing he loved most. But when reviewing all those chapters of his life, Billy held no resentment. He didn't ask, "Why me?" Instead, he sighed very slowly and said to a close friend on a spring evening in 2026, "I've lived a long life, but I've never stopped being lonely." That friend fell silent, knowing the words weren't pessimistic. They were the truth of an artist who had spent his whole life touching the loneliness of others, to the point where there was no room left to embrace his own. But that very loneliness, those wounds that seemed like they would swallow him, became the raw material for the songs that softened millions of hearts like wax under a candle flame. Without that pain, there would be no Piano Man, no Vienna, no The Stranger, no music running through the world's life for 50 years. And perhaps that's why Billy never regretted it, because he understood, even if no one wanted to admit it, that the greatest souls are the ones that have cracked so many times that light could seep through. Many critics say Billy Joel's legacy is the record of selling more than 150 million albums, 6 Grammy Awards, hundreds of sold-out shows, or the unprecedented residency run. But if you asked him, he would just shake his head. Not the numbers, not the awards, not the legend. Billy's true legacy is the people he saved, even though he never knew their faces, never knew their names. The man who once planned suicide but heard Vienna and chose to live one more day. The single mother who heard "She's Always a Woman" and remembered she was strong. The bullied boy who heard Piano Man and understood that, in this world, there were lost souls just like him. The soldier returning from war who heard "And So It Goes" and found his pain in every line. Billy never tried to be anyone's salvation. He just wrote his own truth, and somehow, that truth saved the world from the loneliness they couldn't put into words. And as old age weighed heavier on his shoulders, as memory fell away piece by piece, like autumn leaves, as his hands trembled so much that sometimes they could only touch the piano keys without making a sound, Billy knew his goodbye didn't need to be loud. He didn't need a grand farewell tour, no dazzling tribute ceremony. He just needed to say the last thing he felt in his heart. I tried to live, tried to love, tried to write, tried not to fall, and tried to walk through a world that was sometimes too cruel to sensitive souls. The last night, Billy sat in front of the piano not to rehearse, not to perform, but just to look at it one more time. He placed his hand on the cold keys and whispered, "If this is goodbye, then wherever there's a piano, there will still be Billy Joel's soul." Those words weren't for the audience, not for his family. They were for himself, for the Levittown boy who once wondered if anyone would notice if he disappeared, for the young man who swallowed sleeping pills in a dark room, for the artist mocked over his first album, for the legend cracked by so much pain, for the aging father afraid he would one day forget his children's faces. It was the simplest and most beautiful prayer of a lifetime, that when he left, the best part of him, music, heart, the painful but beautiful truth, would stay with the world, echoing in small rooms, in cars driving at night, in the headphones of lost people needing someone to understand them. And that would always be Billy Joel. Always. When looking back at the entire journey Billy Joel has taken, one cannot help but feel a lingering ache, a poignant sorrow for the man who spent his whole life healing the world with music, while his own heart bore wounds that never fully closed. From a childhood abandoned by his father, clinging to the piano for warmth, onto the desperate night in 1970, when he swallowed sleeping pills because he believed no one needed him. Every step Billy took was through darkness. Yet he kept walking, kept writing, kept singing, creating Piano Man, Vienna, the stranger songs that saved so many lives because they were written from his own loneliness. By the time The Stranger made him a legend, the world only saw the spotlight without seeing the tours that made him lose himself, the nights injecting painkillers just to stand on the MSG stage, or the moment he broke down crying during the 100th show while singing Vienna because he knew his time was running out. The people of America, a country that always honors strength and resilience, can look at Billy Joel's life and see a lesson not from victory, but from fragility. That pain is not a sign of weakness, but proof that we tried to live authentically. Billy was betrayed out of $90 million, endured broken marriages, alcohol addiction, accidents, illness, but he still got back up, still loved again, still became a gentle father, still smiled, even with eyes swollen from sleeplessness. And the greatest lesson he leaves for America is, be kind to one another, because you never know what invisible battle the person beside you is fighting. Billy Joel is proof that even the most shattered souls can create music that makes the world a little gentler. If Billy Joel's tearful yet resilient journey has touched you, please hit subscribe to not miss the next heartfelt stories. Thank you for joining us, and see you in the next video where we continue to honor those who lit up the world with their own pain.